Today, we will hear from Dennis McCann, who is the Wisconsin native, a UW-Madison graduate, and author of 5 books. He has spent most of his professional life traveling around Wisconsin and the Midwest for the Milwaukee Journal and the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. I understand that tomorrow, Dennis will be in Milwaukee to accept a 2016 Notable Wisconsin Author Award from the Wisconsin Library Association. So congratulations to Dennis for that. Dennis is going to tell us about some of the stories in his book, Badger Boneyards, The Eternal Rest of the Story. And University Bookstore will have copies of his book in the lobby after today's meeting for anyone that's interested. We thank University Bookstore for providing the proceeds from today's book sales to our Madison Rotary Foundation. We look forward to your presentation, Dennis, and have made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way of saying thank you. As we welcome Dennis to the podium, just a reminder that if there's time for questions, that we will have microphones floating in the audience for those. So let's please welcome Dennis to the podium.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I was here a few years ago on another book, so it's nice to be invited back. I didn't wear out my welcome, apparently. This book came about somewhat accidentally. I had left the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, retired. I took an early buyout when things started to go south for the newspaper business. And a short time later, Kathy Borkowski from the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, Ellsworth is here, her boss, took me to lunch, and she said, "Do you have any book ideas that we might be interested in?" And I said, "Wow, I always wanted to write a book called Badger Boneyards, The Eternal Rest of the Story." And she looked at me like that wasn't the answer that she was expecting. But I kind of explained what I was talking about, that it would be a book of stories that would all involve a cemetery in some way, very different ways, but there'd be a cemetery involved in each one. And she said, "Well, why don't you submit a couple of sample chapters and we'll take a look at it and see what we think." And so I did that. And time went by, 6 months went by, and suddenly the phone rang, and it was Kathy, and she said, "We'd like to publish your book." And I said, "Great, I better go write it." So I started the research by, first of all, finding all the old columns that I'd written that involved a cemetery, and there were quite a few. I was surprised even myself. And then I went out and found some more. And what I was looking for, and I think I'm going to really disappoint the president here, these are not ghost stories. I think of them as people stories. And they're stories that have outlived the people that made them, but they're there if you want to go out and find them. One of the real delights about just walking through a cemetery, and it doesn't always happen, but a lot of times you'll really be delighted by what you find, be surprised. One of the stories in this book comes from the Oneida Cemetery outside of Green Bay, which is largely a tribal cemetery. There's different styles, a little bit more ornamentation on some of the graves than others. They'll have Packer inscriptions, Packer helmets, family pictures. They might have dream catchers. And one has a very handsome wooden grave, very prominent in the cemetery. And it's got Kenneth Roy Mitoxen's name and the date of his birth and the date of his death. And a big inscription that says, "Listen to me just once." And I just thought that was so wonderful because he got the last word. You don't know who it was directed at, but it gave him an opportunity to, it was his wife or the kids or the government. He wanted someone to listen to him, and that was how he went out. Another time we were having a bench inscribed in Bayfield for a friend who had died. And I was talking to the stonecutter because he was doing it in my driveway and kind of explained my interest in this and asked if he had ever done any really unusual ones. And he said, "No, but go down to Bayfield, which is a small town south of Ashland." And he said, "Go to the back in the new section of the cemetery and you'll see what I'm talking about." So I did that. Forest Home Cemetery, one of the most common cemetery names you'll find. And it's a man's grave and a marker. He gave his name. And it's inscribed, "In 1956, a contest was held to find the meanest woman in the world. Alas, I married the winner and the runner-up with great affection. But if either is buried here next to me, there will be a resurrection." And I just thought that was wonderful. I have no idea what that was about. It had the date of his birth, and there was no date of death yet. So I probably could have called him up and asked, but I just leave it alone. It's too good. Some of the other stories in here I tried to get stories from all over the state. And in so doing, I got stories from cemeteries big and small. Perhaps the smallest is a cemetery in Presque Isle, Wisconsin, way up north of Eagle River. It's called Shanty Boy Hill Cemetery. And what it was a collection of graves that was really stuck in the woods from lumbermen who had died. And some research has been done on some of them. A number of them aren't marked at all. Some of them only have a first name. But there was a school project, and the kids restored the cemetery and have now accumulated some of the stories. And there was one where a boy was just 13 years old, and he died in a pond, and he's buried there with no family around him. And so when you start to get the backstories, then it's more interesting. One of the stories is from Washburn, Wisconsin, near where I live. And to me, this is a reason you should always think about what you're going to put on your marker, because there's stories to tell. You don't get that from this marker, which is my problem with it. The man's name was Tom Blake, and he grew up in Washburn. 1918, when the big flu epidemic came around, he left Washburn, and he kind of roamed around. He became quite an athlete. He was a good-looking guy, and so he made his way to Hollywood eventually. And he became a stuntman in movies. He was an AAU swimmer, a champion swimmer, and so he would be a stuntman for some of the Tarzan movies and things like that. Quite accomplished. Somewhere along the way, he ran into Duke Kahanamoku, the great Hawaiian surfer, and Tom Blake became just enamored with the idea of surfing. So he went to Hawaii eventually, to Waikiki, and learned how to surf. He surfed with the Duke, who became his close friend, and he stayed there for some 30 years. And not only that, he was an inventor. He invented an underwater camera that he used to photograph, that he sold photographs to national magazines. He invented a surfboard with hollow cores so that it would act different. And the Duke adopted one of his surfboard models, and he became known for that. And he took the great honor of riding in the front canoe position with the Duke and his people as they went out to surf. And eventually he tired of all of that and came back to Washburn. So he's buried in the Washburn Cemetery. And when you walk over and you see that it says Tom Blake, U.S. Coast Guard, and the date of his birth and death, and nothing more. And to me, there should be at least a hint there that there's a good story if you can go out and get it. Luckily, he's been well known enough now that the story is easily available. There's a little display on him at the Historical Society in Washburn. But you just don't always know what you get when you walk by somebody in a cemetery like that. If you go to Rhinelander, John Heisman is buried in Rhinelander, the namesake of the Heisman Trophy, which surprises people. He's associated with the New York Athletic Club. He's a prominent football coach, helped come up with some of the rules that made football what it is today, including the use of helmets, because it was a deadly sport at the time. And Heisman is buried in Rhinelander. It doesn't say he's that John Heisman. There's no indication. It's just a flat marker. I had to ask for directions to it when I went to find it. And I ran into a guy who tended the cemetery for a number of years, and he was talking about this. People come to see him often in the fall when the Heisman Trophy is handed out. There'll be a little flurry of interest, and they'll come in and ask where it is, and people will pay their respects. 20 years or so ago, someone left a mason jar on the grave with 4 football tickets, and then sent an anonymous letter to the newspaper saying, you should promote the presence of this guy here a little bit more. And the tickets never got used, of course, but it turned out it was a Minnesota game anyway. So, but that's the kind of stuff that it's. Oh, by the way, no Heisman winner has ever gone to see the grave. Some folks were going to try and get Ron Dane up there a few years ago, but to my knowledge, it never happened. So there's still an opportunity there. One of the other stories in here was a little bit different. It comes from Medford, Wisconsin. There was a tavern there years ago, and it was next to a cemetery, so it was called the Tombstone Tap. And it was owned by a couple of brothers. One of them was Pep Simek, S-I-M-E-K. And Pep was working one Sunday, and he was maybe served himself a little bit, and so he wanted to dance the peppermint twist. And his wife told him to sit down before he fell down, and he fell down before he sat down and broke his leg. So Pep is in the kitchen rehabilitating his leg, and he's tinkering with some recipes for a pizza that he had come up with. And it became very popular. And so they served it at the Tombstone Tap, and it became known as Tombstone Pizza. It became this great invention that eventually was sold to Kraft. And Kraft had an advertising campaign where they showed a man on death row, and he's asked, what do you want on your tombstone? And he said, sausage and pepperoni. And Pep Simek never liked that approach. He didn't think you should be using death to sell his pizzas, but he did very well with it and did a lot of good things for the town with the money that came from that pizza inspired by the cemetery. One of the other stories came from Bayfield, where I live now. In 1942, there was a flood, and if anybody has been to Bayfield, you know that the city is at the bottom of very steep hills. And the flood, about 8 or 9 inches in a very short time, all that water had to go down the hill to get to the lake. And as it rushed down through one of the gorges, it gathered steam and it went right through the town. It leveled buildings, it pushed boats out into the water that had been on land. It threw great big boulders into buildings, started fires, electrical fires. Damage was terrible, but that was only to the buildings. The worst trauma for the community was that the flood had to go through the cemetery to get downhill. And when it rushed through the cemetery, there's 2 cemeteries actually, like many places, the Catholics on one side of the road and everybody else on the other. And I'm not saying anything about this, but it didn't touch the Catholic cemetery at all. It washed out the other one. And it opened up the graves and it opened up the boxes. And so there are bodies strewn all around. It was a terrible trauma. You know, the grave is supposed to be a permanent place. You just think of it that way. And suddenly there's Aunt Harriet going down the hill again. So they had a team of undertakers led by the fire chief and an undertaker whose name was Gildersleeve, which is a great name for an undertaker, who did the best they could to recover all the bodies and rebury them. But they wound up with about 12, 13, something like that they couldn't identify. And they buried those in a common grave together. But there's some wonderful stories that the fire chief had told about trying to put this all back together. They found a woman wearing a nylon stocking in a little valley down below the cemetery. And he said, and it didn't even look like that stocking had a run in it. And they found a man, and his clothing had been pretty much removed except for a green tie. And Ed Erickson said, I think he was an Irishman, but they were never able to identify him. One of the most dramatic cemeteries in Wisconsin, one of the most powerful to visit, is in Peshtigo. 1871, the Great Peshtigo Fire, of course, killed so many people, more than 1,200, or by some estimates, even more than that. A number of those people were buried in a common grave because they were burned so badly they couldn't be identified. A lot of them had been single men working in the woods, working in lumber factories, mills rather. And so they were not able to be identified. They didn't have families. So there's the common grave in the cemetery for the 350 with a big marker outside explaining. But then when you walk through the cemetery, in addition to the headstones, there are historic markers on some of them, kind of giving the personal stories. And they really are tragic. There's one guy who went home when the fire was coming along, and he hitched up the wagon to try and get his family to safety. And in so doing, he must not have hitched it properly. And as he was fleeing the fire, he had to stop and fix the hitch, and a ball of flame just washed over them and killed his entire family. The stories just go on and on like that. It's one of the most poignant to walk through because there's so many tragic endings. There were people who were listed as victims of the Peshtigo Fire, even if they lived 20 years afterwards, because they were still victimized by what had happened to them. It's such an interesting place to visit if you're ever up there. It's well worth walking through that. One of the others that's, I think, especially noteworthy to walk through is in Milwaukee, historic Forest Hill Cemetery. And it's actually called historic. They have a museum there identifying many of the people who are in the cemetery. People like Alice of Alice Chalmers, there's governors, mayors, a whole lot of folks. One of the cool areas is a certain corner of the cemetery where all of the brewing families were put in the same area. So the Schlitzes and the Bests, the Pabsts, the Blatz family. There used to be sort of a competition in the marker business. You'd want bigger and more ostentatious. And in that cemetery, the largest mausoleum was put there by Valentine Blatz. And it's something like 40 feet high and weighs more than 500 tons. So he won the largest mausoleum, which gets you nothing more than the guy without even a grave marker, because they're all there together. But it's interesting that the brewing families are all there in the same area. This is, the cover photo is from the Pabst family grave. It's a real piece of history to walk through that cemetery. My friend John Gerda in Milwaukee wrote a book about the cemetery, and he also pointed out that there are a lot more people there who drank Schlitz and Pabst than whoever got rich making it. But he's right about that. I'm going to read one story, and then I'll take some questions if you have some. This was when I decided to do this book. This was the first story that I went to do. And oddly enough, it's from Norway, Michigan. This story comes from about 6 feet over the Wisconsin-Michigan border, but no artificial boundary should get in the way of a good cemetery tale. Someone once told me when I got to this area, I should slip across the border and visit Digger. Digger is really Ed Wenzel, also called Billy. He was 76 when we met in the early 1990s, and might truly be called the last of a dying breed, a small-town sexton who knows where the bodies are buried because he buried them. When I called to say I was coming, I was struck by Digger's distinctive UP accent, so I bought a tape recorder that night and took it with me the next day. Digger was wearing a cap and work clothes, but with no immediate need to arrange for another permanent lodger, he had time to show me around the piney setting where he worked. I was also, when I told you I collected all the stories that I had written, and I was surprised at how many times I used the word piney setting. So I must have thought each time I was making up this new phrase. I'd been told to ask Digger about the old days, so I did. 1937, April the 1st, 1937, he said. When I walked up here the first day, it was really like a son of a gun. You had to walk 4 miles. There was no cars them days. There was no building, nothing. Just a little old shed down in a hole. They had a wheelbarrow, a shovel, and a rake. That's all they had. Steel wheel, too. You had to dig everything by hand and then wheel everything to the woods by wheelbarrow because there's half of the grave left over. Anybody with common sense knows that. Like I said, you had no place to eat, no shed. 30 below, you had to come out and dig. You had to shovel the snow by hand, no snow blow, all with a scoop shovel. Then I started to plow with a truck without no door. That's how I froze my face. I got $1.50 a day, and then the other guys got $1.25. I got a quarter more because I took the foreman's job. I did it all, take care of the books, the whole damn thing. And I was never a bookkeeper. I was a grave digger, and I told him that. Now I get, well, a guy shouldn't put salaries in there. We only get $325 for digging a grave here. They get $600 and $800 in Iron Mountain. See, we don't have no backhoe. We could have one, but to me it don't seem feasible. It's only sand, you know. We dig them all by hand. A couple of hours in the sand and we dig a hole, and 1 hour after we're done, you couldn't even tell where he was buried. We dig them all year round. I dug at 30 below. You got to pound with a hammer and maul and dig them. When you're young, you can go like heck. Like I said, it's sand. But like I said, it ain't easy. And I hate to say it, but if I hadn't never stayed here, they wouldn't have the cemetery like it is. I don't want to brag about myself, but I know because I keep this up like I keep up my yard at home. But I'm only one man and I'm getting older. I can't cut the mustard like I used to because I fell off the roof 5 years ago and about killed myself. My wife rolled me over and I heard her long miles away saying, "Eddie, your father's gone, I think. I think your father is gone. Go call the ambulance. I think your poor old father is dead." But then I started to roll a bit. She said, "Oh, Lord Almighty, he's starting to move." A woman the other day said, "I never thought you'd be back digging holes again. You were pretty well battered. I broke my arm and my collarbone and my pelvis, but I got out of the damn bed and came back and dug again." You got to be a cemetery man. You got to be dedicated. You got to go with the weather. When there's snow, you know, or a goddamn rainstorm, you got to get out there and you got to get that thing in the ground. If the man says the funeral is 10 o'clock Tuesday, it's 10 o'clock Tuesday. Even though you are dead, you are on time. We sat for a while in the sexton's office where large historic photographs served as decor. Oh yeah, all the miners from that top picture up there, I buried the whole damn bunch of them. Even the widows now, because that's 55 years now, don't forget. See, all these younger guys, this kid will be in here in a while. Funny he ain't here already. They're dead, all these guys. My mother, my father, my brothers I dug. I dug my mother's grave on a Sunday. I dug all my relations too. It never bothered me. Yesterday I buried my classmate. When someone calls up and says so-and-so's dead, you feel kind of funny. You get used to it like anything else. Years ago I done all the digging, but now I get my son Eddie and them kids. They like that. But I know when I'm gone, the day I walk out of here, they're going to go mechanized. I know they are. We drove through the cemetery where I met a host of dead people. The first grave I dug was right there, Billy would say, a man at peace with his accomplishments. He is at home here, and like a good cemetery man, he has planned ahead. His stone is in place, and he knows who will open the earth to receive him. Eddie, he said, like father, like son. That tape recorder was the greatest thing I ever put on an expense account because I wouldn't have been able to catch that without it, but it was a fun time. I entertain any questions. We have time for a couple? Sure. Thank you. Any questions from anybody?
Any questions?
Yes, right here. I have not been to the cemetery for this book. Yeah, that'd be Ed Gein's grave, and I have not done that. They no longer have a marker there, as I understand, because it kept getting stolen. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, what gave you the idea to actually do this book? Obviously, you wanted to do this one and not another book. So what gave you the idea to do this? And did part of the process involve reading other books that people have read, have written about similar topics and learning something from that?
No to the second part. I used to spend a lot of time on the road for the Journal and the Journal Sentinel. And I was able to just go out and find stories that I wanted to write. And cemeteries are full of stories. So that's why I had an interest in it. One of the things that used to delight me most about my job was when I would leave home in the morning and not have an idea what I was going to find, and come home with a column that I was really pleased with. And one of them is in this book. It's from La Crosse. Story of the Virgin M. I was sitting in La Crosse looking in the library. They're reading about something entirely different, and I saw this account of the Virgin M, a woman who was buried in McGregor, Iowa with her 9 husbands. And I thought, that's better than anything I could do else. So I started looking at the record, and so I got as much information as I could, and I left La Crosse and headed down the river to McGregor, Iowa. And as I'm getting to McGregor, I'm thinking, now this can't possibly be true. I don't know where the cemetery is, where she's buried. So I went to the library in McGregor as I got there, and I said, I'm looking for something about the Virgin M. And the librarian pointed to the wall where they had a mural, and there was a picture of a woman with graves all around her. And she's holding flowers and sobbing in this picture. And she told me how to find the cemetery. It's out in the country on a farm, private property. And the disappointing part is she's only buried with her last 3 husbands. But she was a character. She was the first white woman to be married in the city of La Crosse. She came from Ohio. She had a tendency to get married and not divorced, so there were some complications that way. She would just move on. One of her husbands was in jail for killing a man, and his brother came over to her house to reclaim some property, and she shot his brother. Just great stories. One of her husbands, in a court record, had threatened to come back and hang her, but it would have nastied up a perfectly good rope. But when you go there now, the cemetery has been restored, and she's buried with the last 3, and she has, some peace now, I think. But it's just a wonderful story. Long answer, but that's how I just like those stories, people stories. Yes.
I'm just interested, what is the oldest tomb that you visited?
Good question. Madeline Island, there's what's referred to as the Indian Cemetery, has some pretty old ones. There's some very old ones in Green Bay. Prairie du Chien, of course, because they're the oldest communities. A lot of the oldest cemeteries would have disappeared because they were often just buried out in the country and neglected and gone away. And I'm not sure about the oldest, but there's some pretty old ones. Yes?
Any interesting stories from Madison's Forest Hills?
I wrote about the Confederate rest, of course. I was just explaining before, the nice thing about walking through that cemetery is that almost any name that's on any building on campus is also in that cemetery. But the Confederate rest section is kind of cool. These are all the soldiers who died at Camp Randall when it was a prison camp during the war, and they were buried there. And for a long time, their graves were ignored. And then there was a woman who worked in Madison who kind of took over the upkeep of that area, and she called them My Boys. And there's about 140 graves, I think, something like that. And so she's buried in front of them in a little section with the graves she took care of. It's interesting also to look at the way changes in styles come and go. There's a new section where there's a lot of Hmong burials, and they have often will have their own face on the marker. So you can not only read the name and the dates, but see who you're looking at, which is interesting. Somebody else? Yes?
What's going to be on your tombstone?
I'm going to be cremated, and my ashes are going to be spread on the golf course in Bayfield, but not on number 7 because I hate that hole. Of course, you don't have any say in this. I mean, it's whoever is left behind to take care of you is going to, you can order all you want, but if I could just give one piece of advice, think about what you'll put on your own marker, because it's your last chance at self-expression. There's one guy in Walworth County who's buried with the entire terms of his pension written on the stone, including the name of the company that he worked for, International Harvester, and the company president. It's as close as you can get to taking it with you. But so, well, Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dennis. This meeting is adjourned.